I only leaned closer to fix my lipstick. I swear that's all it was. A fleeting moment of vanity before the morning rush, the kind every woman allows herself before she steps into the noise of the world. The sky above the city was the color of steel and ash, the air thick with the scent of car exhaust and early rain. And I was already late for my shift at the diner when I caught sight of my reflection in the sleek, black-tinted window of a car parked just outside. I remember thinking how absurdly shiny it looked, how the surface gleamed like a mirror polished by secrets, and I tilted my head just slightly, checking the curve of my mouth, the line of my eyeliner, my hair that never seemed to obey me. That was when I felt it, that impossible, prickling awareness that I was being watched. At first, I told myself it was nothing, the paranoid flutter of a girl who'd had too little sleep and too much caffeine. But then I noticed the faint movement behind the glass. A flicker. The shadow of someone sitting inside, still as stone but somehow radiating intent, as if the air around him bent in obedience. I couldn't see much, not really. Just the vague impression of a man's outline, broad-shouldered and composed. The faint glint of a ring against his hand resting on the steering wheel. My pulse stuttered. Not from fear exactly, but from something far more confusing. That strange, electric curiosity that makes you want to look longer when you know you shouldn't. For a moment, the city seemed to vanish around me. No honking cars, no shouting pedestrians, no flickering neon from the pawn shop sign across the street. Just that reflection of me framed by his unseen gaze. Two worlds separated by glass. Mine fragile and ordinary. His unreadable and dark. I told myself to move, to keep walking, but I couldn't. My eyes darted toward the window again, and this time I saw the smallest tilt of his head, almost imperceptible, as if he were studying me the same way I was studying him. It wasn't until a horn blared nearby that I tore my gaze away, heart pounding, cheeks flushed with a heat I couldn't name. I muttered something to myself, something about men and their stupid games, and hurried toward the diner's back entrance. But even as I tied on my apron and forced a smile for Mrs. Hanover at table 4, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that moment, that tiny, unremarkable instant by the curb, had shifted something inside me. There's a difference between being looked at and being seen, and I didn't understand that difference until that morning. I'd been looked at before, by customers, by strangers, by men who saw nothing past my body or the way my uniform fit. But that man behind the glass, whoever he was, he saw something else entirely. It was as if he recognized something buried beneath the surface, something I'd tried so hard to keep hidden, and that recognition terrified me. Hours passed, the diner filled with the usual chaos. Coffee orders shouted over the hum of the old jukebox, the hiss of the fryer, the clatter of plates. But my thoughts kept circling back to that car. Every time the bell above the door jingled, my head snapped up, half expecting to see him standing there, though I didn't even know what him looked like beyond the shape of his shadow. When my shift finally ended, I walked home through the drizzle, glancing over my shoulder more times than I could count, half mocking myself for it and half unable to stop. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and a view of the alley, the kind of place you live in when you're saving up for a future that never seems to come. I changed into an oversized sweater, made tea, and tried to lose myself in the comfort of routine. But that night, as I brushed my hair before bed, I saw my reflection again, this time in the cracked bathroom mirror. And I swear for a heartbeat I saw him behind me. Not physically there, of course, but his image flickered through my mind like a phantom memory. The dark car, the steady silhouette, the slow, deliberate way his gaze had pinned me. It replayed again and again, like a film I couldn't stop watching. Who was he? Why did he look at me that way? I told myself it didn't matter, that he was probably just some rich businessman waiting for someone, amused by the sight of a clumsy waitress using his car as a mirror. But deep down, a voice I couldn't silence whispered something different. He wasn't amused. He was deciding. It wasn't fear that kept me awake that night, but a strange, restless energy I couldn't name. I dreamt of glass and smoke, of reflections that didn't belong to me, of hands that reached from behind dark windows and touched my wrist with a kind of ownership that both frightened and thrilled me. When I woke, the sheets were twisted around my legs, and the morning light had a way of making everything feel like a secret I wasn't meant to tell. Days passed, and I almost managed to convince myself it had been nothing, just another weird city moment, until the car came back. It was parked in the same spot, right outside the diner, sleek and black and gleaming even under the clouded sky. This time I didn't dare look directly, but I could feel him inside, that same heavy presence pressing against the glass. My hands trembled as I carried the coffee pot to a booth, pretending not to notice, pretending not to care, but every instinct screamed that the man behind that window hadn't just stumbled into my world. He'd chosen it. That realization should have terrified me. Maybe it did. But what unsettled me most was that a part of me didn't want him to leave. There was something intoxicating about being noticed by someone who carried that kind of power. Like standing too close to a flame just to see how much heat your skin can take before it burns. By closing time, the car was gone again, leaving nothing but the faint impression of its tires in the wet pavement. But I knew, with a certainty that settled low and deep inside me, that this wasn't the end. You can't look into the eyes of a man like that, even for a second, without something in you being claimed. When I locked up the diner that night, the city felt different. The air was heavier, charged, as though something unseen had shifted in my orbit. I didn't know his name, didn't know where he came from, didn't know what he wanted. But I knew this. Whatever he'd seen in that reflection had set something in motion. And the next time our paths crossed, I wouldn't be the one staring through the glass. It started with the sound of tires against wet pavement. Low, steady, deliberate. The kind of sound that doesn't just pass by, but lingers, as though the world itself pauses to make room for it. I was closing up the diner that night, the neon open sign flickering like a heartbeat fighting to stay alive, when I saw the car again through the rain-streaked glass. The same black luxury vehicle, the same tinted windows that seemed to swallow light whole, and for a long moment I stood frozen behind the counter, rag in hand, the distant echo of that first morning replaying in my mind like an unfinished melody. There was something obscene about how beautiful the car looked under the streetlight, sleek, predatory, indifferent to the world around it. And as it idled by the curb, I felt the familiar weight of being watched, that invisible thread tugging at the back of my neck like a reminder of a promise I hadn't meant to make. I told myself not to look, not to give whoever was inside the satisfaction. But curiosity has a cruel way of eroding resolve. And when I finally turned my head, I caught a faint glimpse of movement. The soft glow of a cigarette ember. The outline of a man sitting too still to be ordinary. For a moment, I thought about walking out there. About demanding to know why he kept appearing outside the place I worked. About asking what the hell he wanted from me. But the air around that car felt dangerous, charged with something that didn't belong to the normal world. So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and pretended I wasn't trembling. When I stepped outside, the street was almost empty. The rain had stopped, leaving puddles that mirrored the city lights like fragments of shattered glass, and my reflection followed me in them, warped and uncertain. I walked quickly, keeping my eyes ahead, but I could feel it. The hum of the engine behind me, the slow, deliberate way it rolled forward as I did, as if it was tracing my path. I tried not to run, but by the time I reached the corner, my pulse was a drumbeat in my ears. Then just as suddenly as it had appeared, the car stopped. The window lowered halfway, and a hand, gloved, elegant, the kind of hand that belonged to a man who never lifted anything heavier than a gun or a glass of whiskey, slipped something out and dropped it to the ground before the car pulled away. It was a card, black, glossy, embossed in silver letters so faint they almost disappeared when the streetlight hit them. No name, no logo, just a time and an address written in handwriting that looked too precise to be casual. Saturday, 8 p.m., the Moretti estate. I didn't need to Google it to know what that name meant. Everyone in the city knew. The Moretti family wasn't just powerful. They were a rumor that walked. The kind of people you only spoke about in whispers. The kind whose last name carried the weight of blood and money, and the kind of silence that can bury an entire neighborhood. For hours that night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at that card. The ink gleamed under the dim lamp, and I couldn't tell if it was an invitation or a warning. Maybe both. I told myself not to go, that no good ever came from stepping into the shadows willingly, that men like the one in that car didn't notice women like me without a reason. And reasons in their world were rarely kind. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. And by the time Saturday came, I found myself standing in front of my mirror, wearing the one dress I'd been saving for a better day. The one that made me feel like I could belong somewhere else. Someone else. The Moretti estate sat at the edge of the city, behind iron gates and rows of cypress trees that stood like sentinels guarding old sins. The drive up was long and winding, lined with lights that glowed like watchful eyes, and when the main house came into view, a sprawling mansion of dark stone and glass, cold and regal, I had to remind myself to breathe. 2 men in black suits waited at the entrance, their faces carved from stone, their expressions unreadable. One of them opened my door without a word, and the other simply said, "He's expecting you." He, no name, no introduction, just that single pronoun heavy with ownership, as if the entire world already knew who he was. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and money and danger. The marble floors gleamed beneath my heels, and the walls were lined with art that looked too expensive to exist in the same reality as me. I was led through a corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly before opening into a room dimly lit by chandeliers and candlelight. He was there, sitting at the far end of a long mahogany table, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, his gaze fixed on me with that same unflinching intensity I'd felt from behind the glass days ago. Nikolai Moretti. The name didn't need to be said. It lived in the space between us, in the heavy silence that filled the room, in the way he leaned back slightly, studying me as though he already knew the ending of the story and was simply waiting for me to catch up. He was beautiful in the way storms are beautiful, mesmerizing from a distance, fatal up close. His eyes were sharp and cold, the color of a winter sea. And when he spoke, his voice was smooth but carried an undertone of authority that made obedience feel like instinct. "You looked into my window," he said, swirling the drink in his glass, as if the act of speaking to me required no effort. "And now, here you are." I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to deny, but the words tangled somewhere between fear and fascination. "I didn't mean to—" "Of course you didn't," he interrupted, his lips curving into a small, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. "But you did, and that makes you interesting." The word interesting shouldn't have sounded like a threat, but from him it did. He stood then, slow and deliberate, crossing the room with the kind of grace that comes from knowing exactly how much space he owns. When he reached me, he didn't touch me, not yet, but his proximity felt like a touch all the same. "Do you always wander into things you don't understand?" he asked softly, the scent of smoke and leather clinging to him. I wanted to say yes, that curiosity was my curse, that I'd always been drawn to the edges of danger just to see what it felt like. But before I could answer, he lifted a hand, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face, his eyes studying me as though trying to memorize something he couldn't quite name. "You shouldn't look into mirrors you don't own," he murmured, the words landing somewhere between warning and possession. For a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe. The world seemed to narrow down to the space between us, to the rhythm of his voice, to the quiet promise hidden beneath it. He turned away before I could respond, leaving me standing there, pulse wild, thoughts scattered like shards of broken glass. A man in a suit appeared beside me, silent as a shadow, and handed me a small velvet box before escorting me back toward the entrance. Inside the box was another card, identical to the first, except this one didn't have an address. It had a single line written in the same silver script. "Next time, don't make me invite you." I clutched it all the way home, my heart pounding with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't safety either. I didn't understand him. I didn't understand why he'd chosen me, what game he was playing, or why I couldn't stop thinking about the sound of his voice. But one thing I did know, this wasn't over. Whatever door I'd stepped through that night, it had locked behind me, and the man on the other side wasn't going to let me walk away. When the invitation came, it wasn't in a card this time. It came in the form of a black car waiting outside my apartment, engine idling, gleaming like a shadow made of metal and intent. The kind of car that doesn't ask if you're ready. It simply assumes you are. I stood by the window for a long while, watching it through the thin curtain, my breath fogging the glass as I tried to decide if I was insane for even considering getting into it again. But curiosity, that slow poison that had already begun to sink its teeth into me, whispered that some doors are meant to be opened no matter the cost. The driver didn't speak when I finally stepped outside. He was tall, silent, his suit tailored with precision that spoke of wealth and discipline, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. When I asked where we were going, he only said, "Mr. Moretti requests your company for dinner," as if the word request carried any real meaning when spoken in that tone. Soft, respectful, but edged with the kind of authority that doesn't tolerate refusal. I told myself I could leave whenever I wanted, that I'd go, have dinner, listen to whatever he had to say, and then walk away. But deep down, I already knew that walking away from a man like Nikolai Moretti was a myth. People didn't walk away from him. They were dismissed, released, or buried. The city lights bled away as the car glided toward the hills, the sky deepening into bruised velvet, and my reflection in the tinted window seemed to shift with every passing mile, as if I was watching another version of myself emerge. Someone less afraid. Someone who understood that fascination and danger are often born from the same fire. When the car stopped at the gates of the estate, the world beyond it seemed detached from reality. The long drive lit by lanterns that cast golden halos over the rain-slick pavement, the mansion looming in the distance like a fortress built by someone who trusted no one. Inside, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of cedar and old wine. The same guards were there, the same silent choreography of glances and nods that told me every inch of this place was a stage, and I was the evening's performance. I was led into a grand dining hall where a single table stretched beneath a chandelier that looked like it could crush a lesser secret with one fall. At the far end, he waited. The devil in a suit. Calm, composed, his posture a portrait of control. Nikolai Moretti didn't rise when I entered. He simply looked at me, that same unnerving, deliberate gaze that felt like it was stripping away layers of my soul one by one. "You came?" he said finally, his voice low, steady, not quite a question, more an observation, as if he'd known I would, as if he'd counted on it. "I wasn't sure I had a choice," I replied, my tone sharper than I meant it to be. But his lips curved slightly, the faintest ghost of a smile that didn't touch the ice in his eyes. "There's always a choice," he said, gesturing to the seat across from him. "Some just come with consequences." I sat, though every instinct screamed at me not to. The table between us was set for two. Crystal glasses that caught the light like liquid fire, silver cutlery arranged with surgical precision, plates that looked too fine to ever hold something as simple as food. He poured wine, his movements unhurried, graceful in a way that felt rehearsed, like everything he did was part of a ritual designed to remind the world that control was his true language. We spoke little at first. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was deliberate, a kind of tension that filled the room like static before a storm. When he finally did speak, it wasn't about the weather or the city or even the oddness of our meeting. He spoke about me. "You work at the diner on 14th, he said, his voice smooth but threaded with something that made my stomach twist. "You live alone, no family nearby. You take the late shifts, even when you don't have to. Why?" I stared at him, the wine glass trembling slightly in my hand. "You had me followed," I said, though it came out softer than I'd intended, more awe than accusation. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on mine. "I wanted to understand what kind of woman stops to admire her reflection in a stranger's car. Most people hurry past. You didn't." "I didn't know anyone was watching. That's what made it interesting." There was that word again. Interesting. But the way he said it made it sound like something dangerous, something alive. He didn't look at me like a man studying a woman. He looked at me like a hunter studying movement, like someone fascinated by unpredictability. "You seem to know a lot about me," I said quietly, forcing a small laugh that didn't reach my eyes. "Should I be flattered or terrified?" His lips tilted in a half smile, the kind that belonged to a man who could be either lover or executioner depending on the night. "Both," he said simply, and I felt that word slide down my spine like cold water. Dinner arrived, dishes I couldn't name, flavors that melted like secrets on my tongue, but I barely tasted any of it. The conversation wove between silence and confession, each word heavy, each pause deliberate. He asked about my childhood, my dreams, the things I feared most. And when I hesitated, he leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to that quiet, magnetic tone that made truth feel like surrender. "You think I'm dangerous?" he said, and it wasn't a question. "I know you are." "Then why are you still here?" I looked at him then, really looked, the scar barely visible along his jaw, the faint shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and sins too old to name. And for a moment, I forgot to be afraid. "Because I want to understand," I said. "Understand what?" "You." The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. His gaze flickered to the wine glass, then back to me, as though weighing whether honesty was a currency he could afford. Finally, he said, "I don't think you'd survive understanding me." The words should have scared me, but they didn't. They intrigued me, carved themselves into me, because there was something in the way he said survive that felt like a promise rather than a threat. When the dinner ended, he stood and walked toward me, stopping close enough that I could feel the heat of him, the steady rhythm of his breath. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly against my wrist. Not possessive, not yet, but claiming something invisible all the same. "Next time," he murmured, his voice like smoke curling in the dark. "You won't wait for an invitation." He stepped back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes lingered, deep, cold, endless, before he turned away. The driver appeared once more, silent as always, and escorted me out to the waiting car. As the mansion disappeared behind us, I pressed my fingers to the spot where he'd touched me, feeling the phantom warmth of his skin long after it should have faded. The night outside seemed quieter than before, the world emptier, as if everything ordinary had been stripped away. I told myself I wouldn't see him again, that this was the end, that I'd had my glimpse into the dark, and that was enough. But as the car turned toward the city, I noticed something etched into the fogged glass of the window beside me, faint but deliberate, as though written with a fingertip. "You're already mine." And that was when I realized this dinner hadn't been an invitation. It had been a beginning. It started with the feeling that someone was always watching me, not in the obvious, cinematic sense of eyes from across the street or footsteps in an alley, but in the quiet, unshakable awareness that the world had shifted on its axis, and I was no longer moving through it unseen. It was a whisper at the edge of every thought, a presence that lingered even in solitude, and no matter how many times I told myself it was paranoia, I could feel him, the echo of his gaze, the weight of his intent, somewhere just beyond the reach of light. The diner felt different after that night, though nothing tangible had changed. The same fluorescent hum, the same chipped mugs, the same smell of burnt coffee and grease. Yet the air seemed heavier somehow, dense with something unseen but undeniably there. When the door opened and the bell jingled its usual tired note, I found myself turning too quickly, expecting him, hoping not to see him but terrified that I might. Each time it wasn't him, I felt both relief and disappointment, as if my mind had split itself into two warring halves that wanted opposite things. The first real sign came on a Tuesday, one of those gray mornings when the city felt like it hadn't quite woken up yet. A man I'd never seen before came in, tall, broad, dressed in a black suit that didn't fit the neighborhood, and sat at the far end of the counter. He ordered nothing but coffee, though he didn't drink it. He just sat there, silent, occasionally glancing at the door. When I went to refill his cup, he looked up at me, his eyes a shade too sharp, too observant, and said quietly, "Mr. Moretti sends his regards." My hand froze, the coffee pot trembling. "I don't know what that means," I managed, though my voice betrayed me, thinner than I wanted it to be. He smiled, not kindly but not cruelly either, just enough to let me know he'd said what he came to say. "He knows you've been thinking about him," he said, his tone soft and matter-of-fact, as though he were commenting on the weather. "That pleases him." Before I could respond, he stood, left a crisp $100 bill on the counter, and walked out. The bell jingled again, and then he was gone. The next day, the car was back. It sat across the street this time, half in shadow, its glossy surface reflecting the dull neon of the diner's sign. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every time I turned around, it was there. Patient, unmoving, a dark mirror waiting for me to look again. My coworkers teased me about being jumpy, about zoning out mid-sentence, but how could I explain that the same man who had whispered my name like a secret was now haunting my every reflection? I thought about confronting him. I thought about marching out there, knocking on that window and demanding to know what he wanted, why he couldn't just leave me alone. But the truth, the one I didn't dare admit, even to myself, was that part of me didn't want him to stop. There was something intoxicating in the danger, something addictive in knowing I mattered enough to be watched by a man who could end lives with a word. That night, when I left work, I took the long way home, down alleys slick with rain, past flickering streetlights and shuttered storefronts, hoping to shake the feeling of being followed. But halfway down the block, I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, measured, keeping pace with mine. I turned sharply, heart hammering, and saw only shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt, but the only answer was the soft hiss of water dripping from a broken gutter. I told myself I was imagining things, that the city plays tricks on people when they let fear seep too deep, and hurried the rest of the way home without looking back. When I reached my apartment, the door was slightly ajar. My breath caught, my hand hovering over the knob, a dozen thoughts colliding at once. Had I forgotten to lock it? Had someone broken in? Was he inside? The hallway light flickered overhead as I pushed it open. The faint scent of his cologne, smoke, cedar, danger, clinging to the air. I called out his name, half whisper, half prayer, but there was no response. Inside, everything looked untouched, yet I knew it wasn't. The smallest details gave it away. The chair that had been moved slightly from its usual spot. The glass on the counter now turned upside down. The window that had been cracked open, though I never opened it. And on the table, placed neatly where I couldn't miss it, was another box. Velvet, black, identical to the one from before. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting another invitation, another cryptic command. But instead, nestled inside the silk lining, was a single silver key. Attached to it was a note, handwritten in that same elegant script. For when you're ready to stop pretending you don't want to know the truth. No address this time, no instructions, just the key. Small, simple, heavy with meaning. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window with the key in my hand, tracing its ridges with my thumb, wondering what lock it belonged to, what truth he thought I was avoiding. The city stretched below me, vast and endless, and yet somehow it felt as though the world had narrowed to this. One man, one mystery, one promise that felt like both a threat and a temptation. The next morning, when I arrived at the diner, the same man from before was sitting in the corner booth. He didn't look up as I approached, just slid a folded napkin toward me. Inside, written in the same silver ink, was a single line. Tonight, 10 p.m. Don't bring the key. I already have another one. I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't ask how he knew where I'd be, or how he kept finding ways to reach me without ever truly appearing. I just nodded. Because deep down I understood. This wasn't about permission anymore. This was about inevitability. All day I went through the motions, pouring coffee, taking orders, pretending to laugh when someone told a joke. But my mind was elsewhere, caught in the gravitational pull of something I couldn't escape. Every reflection, in the window, the chrome of the coffee machine, the surface of a spoon, seemed to hold his shadow now, watching, waiting, reminding me that my life before him had been nothing but an illusion of safety. When night came, I found myself standing outside once more, the city humming around me, the air thick with anticipation. The black car was waiting, of course it was. The same driver at the wheel, the same silent acknowledgement as he opened the door. I hesitated only for a heartbeat before stepping inside. He wasn't there. Instead, on the seat beside me lay a small envelope sealed in black wax. My name was written across it, and beneath, a single phrase that made my pulse quicken and my chest tighten with something dangerously close to longing. If you look over your shoulder, you'll see I never left. I turned, and through the darkened glass of the alley, illuminated by a single flickering light, stood Nikolai Moretti. Hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on me, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. And even from that distance, even through the glass and the rain, I felt it again. That silent command, that invisible tether pulling me back toward the place I swore I wouldn't return to. Because I knew now, with every part of me that still remembered fear, and every part that didn't care anymore, he wasn't haunting me. He was claiming me, and the worst part was, I didn't want him to stop. It was raining the night I saw him for who he truly was. Not the man who whispered in shadows, not the dark savior who haunted my steps, but the creature beneath the suit, the one who lived in the space between desire and damnation, the man who ruled his world not with words, but with fear and blood, the kind of night where the sky seemed to grieve for something unseen, every raindrop sliding down the glass like tears that didn't belong to the clouds, and the city outside looked distorted, blurred through the water, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. He'd sent for me again, not with a card this time, not with a message or a man, but with silence, the kind that feels like an order all its own. The car appeared outside my building just as the clock struck 9, its headlights cutting through the storm like eyes that had already seen too much. I told myself I shouldn't go, that I should ignore him, that I had already wandered too deep into his orbit to ever come back unchanged. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me the last time, the way his voice had brushed against my skin like a warning disguised as a kiss, and I found myself walking toward the car as if something inside me had already decided long before my mind caught up. The drive felt endless. The world outside was all gray and motion, streetlights smearing into gold streaks across the wet pavement, and the driver's silence was suffocating. I didn't ask where we were going. I didn't need to. I knew by the way my stomach tightened, by the way the air grew colder the further we went, that this night was different, that I wasn't being summoned for conversation or charm. I was being brought to witness something. When the car finally stopped, I realized we weren't at the mansion. We were in a warehouse district near the docks, the kind of place that reeked of oil, salt, and secrets. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of rain mixing with rust and something else, something darker that made my pulse quicken. The driver opened the door without a word, his expression carved from marble, and I stepped out, my shoes splashing into a shallow puddle that rippled under the weight of my fear. The sound came first, muffled voices, sharp and low, cutting through the steady hiss of rain. Then, as I rounded the corner of the building, I saw them. A group of men, standing in a semicircle beneath a flickering light, their suits soaked, but their postures rigid, attentive, like soldiers awaiting command. And in the center of it all stood Nikolai. He looked different that night, colder, harder, every trace of the seductive composure I'd come to recognize stripped away. He wasn't playing the part of the charming devil anymore. He was simply himself, and that self was terrifying. His sleeves were rolled up, his hands bare, and there was something chillingly casual in the way he held the gun. Not like a weapon, but like an extension of his will. The man kneeling before him was shaking, muttering something in a language I didn't understand, his voice breaking under the weight of whatever crime had brought him there. I should have turned away. I should have run. But I couldn't. I stood frozen, watching through the rain-streaked window of the car, my breath fogging the glass as I tried to convince myself that this wasn't real, that I hadn't stepped fully into his world. But then Nikolai spoke, and the sound of his voice carved through the night like a blade. "You stole from me," he said, his tone quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "And worse, you lied about it." The man pleaded, words tumbling out in desperation, but Nikolai didn't move. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't even look angry. He just watched him, that same unflinching, unreadable gaze I had once mistaken for curiosity. And then, with the smallest movement, he raised the gun. I pressed my hand against the glass, whispering his name. But he didn't hear me, or maybe he did and chose not to. The sound of the gunshot was both deafening and final, a brutal punctuation that tore through the air and left silence in its wake. The man collapsed, his body crumpling into the puddle, the rain washing over him as though trying to erase what had just happened. And then, for a moment that stretched far too long, Nikolai didn't move. He stood there, the rain soaking through his shirt, the gun hanging loosely at his side, his eyes fixed on the body before him. It was the first time I'd ever seen him look human. Not in weakness, but in weariness, as if each drop of rain carried the weight of every sin he'd ever committed. When he finally turned toward the car, our eyes met through the glass. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. He didn't look shocked to see me. He never looked surprised by anything. But there was something in his expression that made my chest tighten. Not remorse, not anger. Something else. Recognition, maybe, or acceptance. He walked toward me slowly, the sound of his footsteps muted by the rain, and when he reached the car, he didn't open the door right away. He just stood there, watching me through the window, the same window where it had all begun, the same reflection that had tied our fates together. When he finally did open the door, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come." "I didn't mean to," I said, though even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. I had come because some part of me had wanted to see the truth, had wanted to know the man behind the glass, even if that truth was made of blood and silence. He leaned in slightly, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my cheek, the scent of rain and smoke clinging to him. "Now you know what I am," he said, his tone flat, devoid of apology. I wanted to hate him. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he was a monster, that he had no right to look at me the way he did after what I'd just seen. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth that terrified me most wasn't what he had done. It was how I felt watching him do it. I should have been repulsed, but instead I felt something else. Something dangerous, something I didn't have a name for, something that burned in the hollow space where fear used to live. He reached up then, brushing his thumb along my jaw, his fingers trembling just slightly. And for the first time I saw a crack in his armor. "You should go home," he murmured, his eyes flickering away for the briefest moment. "Forget this. Forget me." But as he turned to walk away, I caught his wrist, my voice breaking before I could stop it. "I can't." He looked back, the faintest ghost of a smile touching his lips. Not one of satisfaction, but of inevitability. "No," he said softly. "You can't." The car door closed, and the driver started the engine. Through the window, I watched him fade into the rain, the darkness swallowing him whole, leaving only the faint reflection of my own face against the glass, pale, shaken, and irrevocably changed. As the car pulled away, I caught one last glimpse of the body lying in the puddle, the water already diluting the red that bloomed around it. And for a moment I thought I saw my own reflection rippling in that same surface. Blurred, fragmented. No longer the same woman who had once used a car window as a mirror. Because now I understood what he meant when he'd said he didn't want me clean. He wanted me marked. And I already was. I didn't sleep after that night. How could I? When every time I closed my eyes I saw the flash of the gun, the way his expression didn't change as life left another man's body, and the way the rain had washed the blood into the earth, as though the world itself had been trained to accept his violence without protest. I sat in my apartment until dawn, staring at my trembling hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if I could still feel the echo of that moment pressed against my skin. And the strangest part was that beneath the fear, beneath the disbelief, there was something else. Something I didn't want to name because naming it would make it real. Fascination, yes, but darker, deeper. The twisted understanding that I had seen him unmasked, and I still couldn't look away. When the sun finally rose, it felt wrong. Too clean, too bright for a world that had held so much darkness only hours before. The city moved on, as if nothing had happened. As if blood could vanish with the rain. But I couldn't move on. I spent the day at the diner, trying to disappear into routine, pouring coffee, smiling mechanically, laughing when I was supposed to, but every sound, every motion, felt detached, like I was a ghost haunting my own life. Every time the door opened, I looked up expecting him to walk through it, to bring the storm back with him. But he didn't. Instead, the emptiness he left behind followed me like a scent. Heavy, intoxicating, impossible to wash off. It was late that evening when the call came. The phone behind the counter rang just as I was closing up, and when I answered, I didn't hear a voice at first. Only silence. The kind that hums with restrained power. The kind that lets you know you're being studied. Then came his voice. Low, smooth, deliberate. Elena. Just my name, spoken like a confession, and I nearly dropped the receiver. "What do you want?" I whispered, though my voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded smaller, more fragile but maybe more honest than it had ever been. "I want you to come to me," he said, as though the world were built to obey his sentences. "There are things you need to understand." "I don't want to understand," I said quickly, my pulse racing. I saw enough. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough for me to hear him exhale softly, as if my resistance amused him. "No," he said finally. "You saw what I wanted you to see. Now you'll see the rest." Before I could respond, the line went dead. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself I was done letting him pull me into his darkness, done chasing whatever sick fascination had rooted itself in my chest. But later that night, when I found another black car waiting outside my building, the same kind of car that had always meant him, I didn't hesitate. I got in. Because by then, I already knew. I wasn't chasing him anymore. He had me. The car didn't take me to the mansion or the docks this time. It took me to a high-rise downtown, the kind of building that looked sterile from the outside but hid entire empires within. The elevator ride was silent, the kind of silence that builds pressure until you can feel your heartbeat in your throat. And when the doors opened, I stepped into a world of glass and shadow. His office was vast, overlooking the city lights, like a throne room made of reflection. He stood by the window, back turned, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of whiskey that caught the light like liquid fire. "You came," he said without turning around. "You called," I replied, though the words felt hollow. He finally faced me then, and for a moment I almost forgot how to breathe. In the soft light, he looked both unreal and painfully human, like something sculpted from contradictions. Power and loneliness, cruelty and grace. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." I didn't. "Why am I here?" I asked. "Because you know too much to pretend you're innocent," he said simply, his gaze sharp enough to cut through pretense. "And because I'm not done with you." The words sank into me slowly, like a poison that tasted sweet at first. "Not done with me?" I repeated, forcing a laugh that sounded too brittle. "What does that even mean, Nikolai? You think you can just drag me into your world, scare me half to death, and then what? Expect me to just stay?" He set his glass down, the soft clink echoing in the vastness of the room. "I don't expect," he said quietly. "I decide." There it was. The truth I'd known but never said aloud. He didn't live by chance. He didn't ask. He didn't hope. He commanded, and the world bent to his will. I shook my head. "You killed a man," I said, my voice cracking. "You shot him like he meant nothing." "He did mean nothing," Nikolai said, his tone even, too calm. "He betrayed me. In my world, betrayal is a death sentence." "Your world," I repeated, the words sharp with disgust and disbelief. But even as I said them, I knew I was already a part of it. He moved closer then, slow, deliberate, until there was only inches between us, until I could feel the heat of him radiating through the space. "You keep saying it like you don't belong in it," he murmured, his voice low, dangerous. "But tell me, Elena, if you were so disgusted, why didn't you run? Why are you here now?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Because he was right. I should have run, but I didn't. I should have screamed, but I hadn't. I should have wanted to escape him, but instead I was standing in front of him, trembling not from fear, but from the unbearable pull that kept dragging me back to him. "You don't know what I want," I said softly. He smiled then, slow, cruel, knowing. "I think I do." He turned and walked back to his desk, opened a drawer, and pulled out a document, thick paper, neatly folded. He placed it in front of me. "This," he said, "is a contract." I stared at it. "What kind of contract?" "The kind that keeps you alive," he said simply. "Your brother owes money to men who don't forgive debts. I paid them off this morning." My heart dropped. "You... what?" He owed them more than he could ever repay, Nikolai continued, his tone calm, businesslike, as if discussing the weather. He's free now. You're welcome. I felt dizzy, my thoughts scattering like leaves in a storm. Why would you do that? He met my gaze. Because I'm not in the habit of giving something for nothing. It hit me then, the true meaning of the deal he was offering. What do you want? I whispered. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes burning into mine. Loyalty, he said, honesty, obedience, and maybe... He paused, his voice dropping lower, almost tender. Maybe a little bit of you. I should have refused. I should have thrown that contract back at him and walked out, but instead I stood there silent, because the truth was that I had already given him those things without a signature. I had already become part of his world the moment I'd looked into that car window. He slid the paper toward me. Sign it, and you'll be under my protection. No one will touch you. No one will dare. You'll belong to me. I stared at the pen in his hand, at the faint tremor in my own fingers as I reached for it. The rain outside tapped softly against the glass, a steady rhythm that felt like a countdown. My heart pounded so hard it almost hurt. As I pressed the pen to the paper, I heard him murmur something, low, almost to himself, but the words seared into me all the same. You don't wear my name, he said. You wear my protection. And I knew then, with a clarity that felt like surrender, that this wasn't freedom. It was the most exquisite kind of cage. When the ink dried, he smiled, slow and dangerous. Welcome to my world, Elena. And though I didn't say it aloud, I knew the truth. I hadn't entered his world. I'd been his from the moment he first looked at me through that glass. It's strange how quickly a cage can start to feel like safety. How easily the walls that confine you can begin to resemble protection when the person who built them knows exactly how to make you forget they exist. After I signed that contract, after I handed him my freedom disguised as a favor, the world as I knew it dissolved. Not with noise or violence, but with silence. The kind that wraps itself around you like velvet, warm and suffocating all at once. Nikolai didn't ask me to move into his mansion. He didn't need to. He simply started removing the world I used to belong to until there was nowhere else left to stand. The diner was the first to go. I arrived one morning to find it shuttered. The windows covered with brown paper. A handwritten sign taped to the door that said, "Closed until further notice." The owner, Mr. Hanley, left me a message later that day, his voice apologetic but confused, saying something about unexpected buyouts and generous compensation. I didn't need to ask who had orchestrated it. There was only one man who could turn an entire slice of my life into dust with a single phone call. When I confronted him that evening, standing in the vast stillness of his office, the city glittering behind him like 1,000 unkept promises, he didn't look up from the papers on his desk. You don't need that job anymore, he said, his tone calm, almost distracted. It was never going to keep you safe. I didn't ask to be kept safe, I snapped, though even as the words left my mouth I knew they were only half true. He lifted his gaze then, slow and deliberate, his eyes the color of smoke before a storm. No, he said softly. You asked to understand me, and now you do. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I hadn't asked for any of this, that safety wasn't worth the price of being owned, but the words tangled in my throat, caught somewhere between defiance and longing. Because the truth was, I had begun to crave the way his presence filled every space I entered, the way he could silence a room just by walking into it, the way his voice could make obedience sound like desire. The second thing to vanish was my apartment. When I returned home one night, there was nothing left inside. Not my clothes, not my photographs, not even the chipped mug I'd bought from a thrift store years ago. Every trace of my old life had been stripped away, replaced with a simple note lying on the floor near the door. You live where you are protected. N. The next morning, his driver appeared outside, waiting with the same silent patience that had become a language of its own. The mansion was no longer a place I visited. It became the world I inhabited. Every inch of it bore his presence. The dark, polished floors that reflected the low glow of candlelight, the scent of cedar and smoke that clung to the walls, the quiet rhythm of footsteps belonging to men who never spoke unless spoken to. He gave me a room overlooking the gardens, larger than my entire apartment had been, with windows that opened to the sound of wind moving through the cypress trees. It should have felt luxurious, but it didn't. It felt like being buried alive in beauty. The wardrobe was already filled with clothes in shades of black, cream, and wine, all perfectly fitted, all chosen by him. When I asked what had happened to my old things, he said, "You don't need reminders of who you were. You're not her anymore." Sometimes I caught myself believing him. He had a way of making the world bend toward his version of the truth, of speaking in absolutes that left no room for argument. When he spoke, even silence felt like agreement. Days passed in a strange rhythm I couldn't quite name. I learned the habits of the house, the way the guards rotated at dusk, the way the kitchen lights always dimmed after midnight, the way his office door remained slightly ajar when he wanted me to come in without being summoned. And I did, always. I told myself I was free to leave, but every path led back to him. It was during one of those nights, when the sky outside burned violet and the air was heavy with the scent of rain, that he came to my room. I was sitting by the window, staring at my reflection in the glass, trying to remember what I looked like before his world reshaped me. The door opened quietly behind me, and though he didn't speak, I knew it was him, by the way the air shifted, by the quiet certainty that followed him everywhere. "You shouldn't sit in the dark," he said, his voice softer than usual, almost thoughtful. "I wasn't waiting for you," I lied, though we both knew I was. He moved closer, his reflection joining mine in the window. Two ghosts framed in the glass, his figure solid, mine blurred by the faint tremor in my breath. "No," he said quietly, "but you were thinking about me." When he touched my shoulder, it wasn't gentle. It wasn't cruel either. It was ownership disguised as affection. His fingers traced the line of my collarbone, slow and deliberate, and when he leaned in, I felt his breath against my neck. Warm, controlled, the calm of a man who never takes what isn't already his. "You belong to me now," he murmured, not as a question, but as a fact. I wanted to deny it, to tell him that belonging was not the same as being bound. But the truth pulsed too loud between us, and I couldn't lie to myself anymore. He turned me to face him, his eyes holding mine with that same terrible gravity that had trapped me since the day I first saw his reflection in the glass. "There are people who would hurt you to hurt me," he said. "I need them to see that you are untouchable." I frowned, my pulse quickening. "And how exactly do you plan to make me untouchable?" He smiled, a slow, knowing curve of his lips that made my heart stutter. "By marking what's mine." Before I could ask what he meant, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside, nestled against black silk, was a necklace. Silver, delicate, the pendant shaped like a small circle of mirrored glass. "Wear this," he said. "It's not jewelry, it's protection." When I lifted it, I noticed the faint glint of technology embedded in the metal. A tracker, maybe, or something worse. I looked at him, my voice unsteady. "So you can watch me?" "So I can find you," he corrected softly, stepping closer. "If anyone ever tries to take you from me, I'll come for you. Always." The words should have frightened me, but they didn't. They wrapped around my spine like heat, a promise carved in danger. I let him fasten the necklace around my throat, the cool metal settling against my skin like a brand. When he was done, he traced a finger along the pendant, his touch lingering. "You don't wear my name," he whispered. "You wear my protection." After he left, I stood before the mirror for a long time, staring at the glint of silver at my throat. It shimmered faintly in the low light, beautiful and terrible all at once. I should have felt trapped, but instead I felt seen, claimed, defined in a way I had never been before. That night, as I lay in bed, the rain began again, soft and steady against the windows, and I thought of him. The way his voice filled every silence, the way his eyes found me in every reflection. I told myself this wasn't love. It couldn't be. Love didn't sound like ownership, didn't taste like fear. And yet, when I closed my eyes, all I could think was that no one in the world had ever looked at me the way he did, as though I wasn't something fragile to be protected, but something rare to be possessed. And deep down, buried beneath the shame and the thrill, I realized the most terrifying truth of all. I didn't want to escape him anymore, because some cages are too beautiful to leave. There are moments when silence speaks louder than words, when the air itself seems to hum with things unspoken, and I began to notice that the longer I lived inside Nikolai Moretti's world, the louder that silence became, as though the walls of his mansion were filled not with echoes of the present, but with ghosts that refused to stay buried. He had given me everything: protection, luxury, power that I neither earned nor wanted. Yet beneath all of it, beneath the glittering surface of control and wealth, there was something fragile, something hollow, as if the entire empire he ruled was built upon a single, unhealed wound. It started with the portrait. I found it one evening when I was wandering through the upper corridor of the mansion, a wing I'd never been in before, where the lights burned lower, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old roses. The corridor was lined with paintings, landscapes, portraits, scenes of forgotten grandeur. But it was one at the far end that stopped me. It wasn't large or ornate like the others. It hung in a quiet corner, half shadowed by the flickering light of a single chandelier, and yet it drew me in with an almost magnetic pull. When I stepped closer, I understood why. The woman in the painting could have been me. Not exactly. Her hair was slightly darker, her mouth a little softer, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The tilt of her head, the sharpness in her eyes, even the faint dimple near her cheekbone. It was like looking at a reflection from another time. She wore a pale dress that looked fragile against the dark background, her hands resting gracefully in her lap. And yet there was something restless in the way she'd been painted, something alive beneath the stillness, as though even trapped in oil and canvas, she refused to be entirely contained. I don't know how long I stood there staring, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I heard his voice behind me. She was beautiful, wasn't she? I turned, startled, and found Nikolai leaning against the doorway, his expression unreadable, though his eyes, always so composed, so careful, looked different tonight. Softer, maybe. Sadder. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice low, because the air between us felt too heavy for anything louder. He stepped closer, his gaze never leaving the portrait. "Her name was Isabella," he said, the syllables rolling off his tongue like a prayer he'd forgotten how to say. "She was supposed to be my wife." The words settled in my chest like ice. I didn't move, I didn't speak. I just watched him, the man who had built an empire out of dominance and fear, look at a ghost as if she still held power over him. "What happened to her?" I asked finally. He hesitated, just for a breath, but it was enough to tell me that the story wasn't one he shared often. "She died," he said, his tone flat, but underneath it, there was a thread of something raw, a fracture barely hidden. "How?" His jaw tightened. "Wrong place, wrong time." I wanted to believe him, but the way his voice broke, the way his eyes flickered toward the window as though afraid to meet mine, told me that wasn't the whole truth. I turned back to the painting, my pulse quickening as I traced the familiar curve of the woman's face with my eyes. "She looks like me," I whispered, not as accusation but as realization. Nikolai's silence stretched for too long, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Yes," he said, "she does." For the first time since I'd met him, I felt something close to fear. Not the sharp, immediate kind that makes you flinch, but the slow, creeping kind that starts in your stomach and spreads until it fills your lungs. I didn't know what I was to him anymore. A woman, a possession, a shadow of someone he couldn't let go of, and the thought made my skin prickle with unease. "Is that why I'm here?" I asked, forcing myself to look at him. "Because I look like her?" He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment the mask slipped, the perfect composure, the quiet authority, and what I saw beneath it was exhaustion, maybe even guilt. "When I first saw you," he said, his gaze drifting toward the painting again, "I thought I was seeing a ghost. You looked through that car window, and for a second I believed the universe was mocking me, giving me back what it had taken, only to remind me I could never have it again." He stepped closer then, and his voice softened, almost breaking. "But you're not her. You never were. You're something else entirely." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to. But the look in his eyes, that haunted flicker of memory, told me the truth he couldn't say aloud. Maybe I had become something else, but to him, I would always be a reflection of what he'd lost. I turned away, unable to bear the weight of his gaze. "You don't love me," I said quietly. "You love the ghost of someone who's gone." He moved before I could take another breath, his hand catching my wrist, his grip firm but not cruel. "Don't tell me what I feel," he said, his voice low, dangerous, trembling at the edge of control. "You think I don't know the difference between the living and the dead? You think I can't see what's right in front of me?" His touch was fire, and I hated that I wanted to stay in it. "Then what am I to you?" I asked, meeting his eyes, daring him to answer. For a moment he didn't speak. He just looked at me, and there was something wild in that silence, something breaking. When he finally did answer, it wasn't with the certainty I'd come to expect from him, but with the honesty of a man who had finally stopped pretending. "You're a mistake I can't stop making," he said. The words hit harder than any confession could have. I felt them sink into me, raw and irreversible, and before I could speak, before I could think, he kissed me. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't even kind, it was desperate, a collision of memory and need, of grief disguised as hunger. I should have pulled away, I should have slapped him, screamed at him, done anything but what I did, which was kiss him back. When he finally let me go, he didn't apologize. Nikolai Moretti never apologized. He just stepped back, breathing hard, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't name. "I told myself I wouldn't do that," he said, more to the floor than to me. "You make me forget things I can't afford to forget." I wanted to speak, to ask what exactly he meant, but he turned away, walking toward the door. At the threshold he paused, his back still to me. "Don't come to this part of the house again," he said. "Some ghosts aren't meant to be disturbed." And then he was gone. I stood there for a long time, my heart pounding, my lips trembling, the taste of him still lingering like a curse. When I looked back at the portrait, the flickering chandelier light made it seem as though the woman was smiling, a small, knowing curve of her mouth that hadn't been there before. That night, as I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling, I realized something terrible. I wasn't jealous of her. I was afraid of her. because if she was his past, then I was her continuation. And the thought of inheriting a dead woman's fate wrapped around me like a prophecy waiting to be fulfilled. And somewhere deep down, I knew this. Ghosts don't haunt the living without reason. Sometimes they just want company. I had always believed that the worst kind of danger was the kind you could see. The flash of a gun, the echo of footsteps in the dark, the silhouette that lingers too long at the edge of your vision. But I was wrong. Because the true danger, the kind that ruins you from the inside out, is quieter, subtler. It wears the shape of comfort and whispers your name like a promise. It's the moment you start trusting the very thing that's been unraveling you all along, and by the time you realize it, it's already too late. After the night I found the portrait of Isabella, something changed between Nikolai and me, though neither of us said it aloud. He became distant in the way a man becomes distant not because he wants to leave, but because he's terrified of what he might destroy if he stays. The air between us was always charged, always heavy with something unsaid, and every time his eyes met mine, I saw the ghosts he refused to name. Not just hers, but his own. He stopped visiting my room at night. He stopped calling me Devushka, the Russian word he'd once said like a secret. He started locking his office again, and when I passed by those doors, I heard the low murmur of voices. Men who came and went without names, carrying with them the Aussies, scent of cigarettes and secrets. I told myself not to care, that I didn't belong in his world, that what he did in it was none of my concern. But I couldn't stop listening for his footsteps, couldn't stop waiting for that familiar shadow to cross my doorway. One evening, I followed him. He left the mansion after midnight, dressed in black, his movements so quiet it was as if he'd learned to move through the world without leaving a trace. I waited 5 minutes before slipping out behind him, my heart pounding in my throat. The rain falling soft and cold as I trailed the car down the winding drive until it disappeared into the city. I took a cab, whispering directions that barely made sense, my fingers shaking around the edge of the seat. The car stopped at an old building near the river. Brick, windowless, the kind of place that had seen more crime than daylight. I stayed in the shadows as he entered, but before the door closed, I caught a glimpse of the men waiting inside. Broad, armed, faces too hard to belong to anyone innocent. I knew I shouldn't have gone inside, but something stronger than fear pulled me forward. I crept along the wall, the sound of my heartbeat louder than the rain. When I found the narrow stairwell that led down to the lower level, I could hear them. Nikolai's voice, calm and measured, and another man's, rougher, angrier. "You think you can control everything?" the stranger was saying, "but you can't even see what's happening under your own roof." Nikolai's reply came low, dangerous, steady as the click of a safety being released. "I see everything, including men who forget who they owe their lives to." I dared to peer around the corner. The room was dim, lit only by a hanging bulb that swung slightly from the draft. Nikolai stood near a table covered in papers, his gun resting at his side, his face composed but his eyes sharp as a blade. The man across from him was older, heavier, his jacket soaked through with rain. "Your empire's falling apart," the man said. "Your enemies know about her." The word hit me before I could process it. Her. Me. My breath caught, but I clamped a hand over my mouth, forcing myself to stay still. Nikolai's eyes narrowed. "Be careful with your words." "You think hiding her will save her?" The man sneered. "You're not the only one who remembers Isabella. The Bratva remembers too. They know the girl in your house, the one who looks just like her. They know what she means to you." The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the slight twitch in Nikolai's jaw, the muscle that flexed only when he was trying to keep himself from exploding. "If they touch her," he said quietly, I'll burn their entire world to the ground." The man laughed, and I heard the sound of something metallic, the cocking of a gun. "You won't have to burn it," he said. "It's already on fire." The next moments were chaos. Nikolai moved faster than I could comprehend, a blur of precision and violence. The gunshot echoed off the concrete walls, followed by another and another. I flinched, pressing back against the wall as shouts filled the air. By the time I dared to look again, the other man was on the floor, a dark pool spreading beneath him, and Nikolai was standing over him, breathing hard, his hand still steady on the weapon. He didn't see me at first, but then, as if some invisible thread pulled his gaze, he turned. His eyes met mine through the half-open doorway, and the look that passed between us was unlike anything I'd ever seen in him. Not anger, not shock, something worse. Fear. "Elena," he said, his voice sharp, cutting through the distance. "What are you doing here?" I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my body trembling. I took a step back, but before I could answer, I heard it. The echo of footsteps behind me, the sound of a gun being raised. "Don't move!" a voice growled, and before I could react, a hand grabbed me from behind, yanking me backward. I screamed, the sound tearing through the silence as cold metal pressed against my neck. Nikolai's expression changed instantly. All control gone, replaced by something primal and vicious. "Let her go," he said, his voice low but deadly. The man holding me laughed. "You think you're untouchable, Moretti? You think your ghosts can't bleed?" The next few seconds were a blur. Nikolai lunging forward, the flash of gunfire, the smell of smoke and blood. The man behind me jerked violently, and I felt the weight of his body collapse before I even understood what had happened. Nikolai caught me as I stumbled, pulling me against him, his arms iron around my trembling frame. "I told you not to follow me," he whispered harshly, his breath warm against my ear. "I told you not to come near this." "I had to know," I choked out, my voice shaking. "You kept everything from me. You kept her from me." His grip tightened. "You don't understand. This isn't about her anymore." "Then what is it about?" He looked down at me, and in that moment the mask fell completely. His eyes were wild, desperate, burning with something that looked too much like regret. "It's about you," he said. "They're coming for you because of me." Before I could respond, the door at the far end of the room burst open. Shouts filled the air. More voices, more footsteps. Nikolai's men rushed in, guns drawn, shouting commands I couldn't understand. Someone grabbed me, pulling me toward the exit. But I twisted free, turning just in time to see Nikolai raise his weapon again. The world exploded into noise, bullets, screams, smoke. I hit the floor, crawling toward the wall, my hands slick with blood I couldn't tell was mine or someone else's. A sharp pain sliced through my arm, but I barely felt it. All I could see was him, standing in the saw, middle of the chaos, fighting like a man who knew he wouldn't make it out. "Nikolai!" I screamed, my voice raw, but he didn't look back. One of the men reached for me, shouting something in Russian, and before I knew it, I was being dragged out through a side door, my vision blurring, my body trembling with shock. I fought to see him one last time, to make sure he was still standing, but the last thing I heard before the door slammed shut was another gunshot. Loud, final, echoing through the dark. The car engine roared to life, and the city lights blurred into streaks as we sped away. I pressed my hand to the wound on my arm, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my mind spinning between disbelief and terror. "Where is he?" I whispered to the driver, my voice barely audible. "Where's Nikolai?" The driver didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, his jaw tight. When we reached the mansion, I stumbled out before the car even stopped, running through the doors, calling his name. But the house was silent. Too silent. the kind of silence that feels like mourning. And then I saw it. On the marble table in the foyer, a single object gleaming under the chandelier light. My necklace. The one he'd fastened around my throat with a promise of protection. Only now, the pendant was cracked straight down the middle, a thin line of blood smeared across its surface. I sank to my knees, the weight of it hitting me like a blade to the chest. Because even before anyone said it, even before the phone rang with the news I already feared, I knew. He hadn't made it out. For days I lived in a silence that did not belong to the living, a silence so thick, so consuming, that it felt as though the entire world had stopped breathing the moment he did. Time lost its edges. Morning and night bled into one another, until I couldn't tell whether I was awake or trapped in the fevered echo of a dream that refused to end. The mansion, once pulsing with invisible life, became a mausoleum. His men moved like ghosts through the halls, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes averted, as if saying his name too loudly might summon something they weren't ready to face. I became a shadow inside those walls, a ghost haunting the ghost of a man who had built his kingdom from power and ended it with blood. They said he was dead. They said the last bullet had found him just as he was dragging one of his men to safety, that he had fallen near the old river docks where the rain still hadn't stopped. They said there was too much blood to mistake it for anything else. But there was no body. There was no grave. Just an absence that felt too deliberate, too clean, like a wound that refused to scar. I told myself I should leave, that I should take what he'd given me and run as far as I could, that this house, this life, this story that had consumed me didn't belong to me anymore. But I couldn't. His world had wrapped itself around me, too tightly, like a second skin I could no longer peel away. His scent still lingered in the air, faint but impossible to forget. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moved through the cypress trees, I swore I could still hear his voice, low, commanding, threaded with the promise of things unfinished. It was on the 7th night after his disappearance that I found myself drawn back to the place where it had all begun, the street outside the diner, where months ago I had leaned against a car window and met the gaze of the man who would ruin and remake me all at once. The city was quiet, the rain soft, the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt and memory. The diner had reopened under new management, its lights spilling weakly across the pavement. But the car was not there, only the faint reflection of myself in the glass, pale and hollow-eyed, as if I were looking at someone I used to be. I traced my finger across the window, following the outline of my reflection, and for the first time I realized how much I had changed, how much of him lived in me now. The way I carried my shoulders, the way my gaze held steady even in darkness, the way I no longer flinched at the sound of thunder or the sight of blood on the pavement. I was no longer the girl who'd used a stranger's car as a mirror. I was something else. Something that belonged to both worlds, his and mine. I turned to leave, but that was when I saw it. The car. The same black vehicle, sleek and silent, materializing out of the rain as if conjured from the shadows themselves. It rolled to a stop at the curb, and for a moment I couldn't move. My breath caught, my heart stuttered, because part of me knew it was impossible. He was gone. He was dead. But another part of me, the part that still felt the phantom weight of his hand on my skin, whispered that impossibility had never stopped him before. The driver's door opened first, and I recognized him instantly. Victor, Nikolai's most loyal man, his expression a mask carved from granite. He said nothing as he walked around the car and opened the back door. And then I saw him. Nikolai Moretti. Alive. He looked different, and yet exactly the same sharpness in his eyes, the same quiet authority in the way he moved, but his face bore new lines. His arm was bandaged, and there was a tiredness to him. a heaviness, like a man who had fought the devil and wasn't entirely sure who had won. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain fell between us, thin and endless, the world holding its breath. Finally, he stepped forward, his gaze fixed on mine, and when he spoke, his voice was low, roughened, human in a way I'd never heard before. "You shouldn't be here." I laughed, a broken, bitter sound that cracked under its own weight. "That's what you said the first time I found you." He almost smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I told you not to follow me. And you told me you'd find me if anyone ever tried to take me away," I said, my voice trembling. "So why did you let them think you were dead?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past me, toward the diner, toward the life I'd lost, and said quietly, "Because the only way to protect something is to make the world think it's no longer worth stealing." His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to be angry, to scream that he had no right to decide what my life was worth, that I had spent days mourning him, drowning in a silence that wasn't mine to bear. But when I looked at him, the exhaustion etched into his features, the pain he didn't bother hiding, I understood. He hadn't disappeared out of cruelty. He had done it the only way he knew how, through sacrifice. He took a step closer, and I could see it in his eyes now. The thing he never said but always meant. The apology. The confession. The truth. "I thought I could keep you out of this," he said. "I thought I could give you back the life I took. But every time I tried to let you go, I found you here." He tapped a hand lightly against his chest. "You became the one thing I couldn't protect myself from." The words undid me. All the walls I had built, all the strength I had pretended to have came apart in that moment. "You can't keep living like this," I whispered. "Always running, always fighting shadows." He smiled faintly, a ghost of his old self. "I was born in shadows, Elena. But you were supposed to be my light." I shook my head, tears hot and merciless on my cheeks. "Light can burn, Nikolai. Sometimes it doesn't save. Sometimes it destroys." He reached for me then, his hand trembling slightly as it brushed against my face. "Then let it destroy me," he said softly, "as long as I die looking at you." I don't know who kissed whom first. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe it was always going to happen. Inevitable, doomed, perfect in its own tragic symmetry. The rain poured harder, blurring the world around us, washing away everything but the taste of him, the feel of his hand in my hair, the sound of my heartbeat syncing with his. When we finally broke apart, his forehead rested against mine, our breaths tangled. "There's no going back," he murmured. "If you stay in my world. And there's no forgiveness there, only survival." "I stopped wanting forgiveness a long time ago," I said. "I just want you." He closed his eyes, and for the first time I felt him shake. Not with fear, but with surrender. The headlights of another car appeared in the distance, slicing through the rain. He turned, his expression shifting, his body tensing like a man already halfway to war. "They know I'm alive," he said quietly. "They'll come." "Then we'll face them," I whispered, my hand finding his. "Together." For a heartbeat, he looked at me as though seeing something holy, something he didn't believe in anymore but wanted to. Then he squeezed my hand, and without another word, we stepped back into the car, the rain roaring around us, the city lights melting into liquid gold through the windows. As the car pulled away, I looked at my reflection in the glass. Not the frightened girl I once was, but the woman I had become. And behind me, I saw his reflection too. Steady, unyielding, the same man who had once watched me through this very window and decided I was something he could never let go of. And in that moment, I understood what it meant to belong to someone not because they owned you, but because they saw you. The parts you hid, the darkness you tried to bury, the reflections you were too afraid to face. The rain blurred our faces together on the glass, two silhouettes bound by the same madness, the same love, the same unspoken truth. Some stories don't end where they should. Some burn too bright to fade quietly. And as the city vanished behind us, I realized ours was one of them. Because in the end, the mirror didn't lie. It never had. It had simply been waiting for both of us to finally see what was always there.